So, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this session at the Civic Universities Network Conference. I'm Chris Husbands. I'm Vice-Chancellor of Sheffield Hallam University. It's a pleasure to welcome you. One of the most striking features of the world over the last generation has been the transition from a low participation to a high participation higher education system. A generation ago, a small minority of young people went on to higher education. In the UK, the figure is now about 40% of 18-year-olds, similar figures in Australia and New Zealand, slightly higher in the United States, considerably higher in the Far East, lower but rising rapidly in the global South. As participation has risen, so questions have been asked about the relationship between universities and the wider educational systems in which they operate. And what we're going to do this afternoon is to open up a range of perspectives on the relationship between universities and the education system more generally, between universities and education attainment for those young people who may or may not themselves progress to higher education. What is the relationship between universities and the school system, between universities and the skills system, between universities and further education? What is the role of universities in raising educational attainment and aspiration? And to do that, we have a really interesting and engaged panel. I'm very much looking forward to hearing from them. We want to begin this by looking, as a case study, at work that we've undertaken here at Sheffield Hallam. The programme South Yorkshire Futures that we established a few years ago as our way of thinking about the relationship between this university and the schooling system in Sheffield and South Yorkshire. And to provide us with an introduction to that, I'm delighted to welcome Greg Burke. Greg is director of the Civic Universities Network, but he's also director of the South Yorkshire Futures programme. He's a former civil servant with wide experience in policy making and policy delivery, and I'm delighted to welcome Greg to give us an outline of South Yorkshire Futures. Greg.
Thanks very much, Chris. Shireen, I think you're going to put the slides up for me. Brilliant, thank you. As Chris said, I'm just going to give a bit of context around the programme that we call South Yorkshire Futures, which is very much in this space of a university doing stuff in the education system beyond the remit that we might traditionally have operated in. So just to start with, I wanted to give a little bit of context of the sort of educational landscape of South Yorkshire. So just looking at the Sutton Trust Mobility Index. It's a little bit out of date now because it hasn't been updated for a few years, but I think it's probably still very much the position in South Yorkshire. And of the 14 South Yorkshire constituencies, 10 have very low or low social mobility. And what's particularly interesting is only one constituency within South Yorkshire has has very high social mobility. So moving on to the next slide. I think there's very strong evidence and recognised, from government and from educationalists that the quality of schools has a huge impact on the outcomes for young people. And so actually this whole sense of what sort of school, what quality of school does a young person from a more deprived background go to? And so for England as a whole, 87% of the most deprived pupils attend good or outstanding schools. Whereas in South Yorkshire, this is very different. So at the lowest, 53% in Doncaster and 71% in Barnsley and Sheffield. So you can see the gap between the national position and the landscape of South Yorkshire. Moving on to the next slide. So we recognised, this was nothing new. We understood that we had an educational landscape where young people were achieving lower than they might. And when we looked at the whole range of data sets, young people in South Yorkshire were less likely to achieve academic success and were less likely to progress even when they did achieve academic success. So we spent quite a bit of time understanding that landscape, understanding the context in which we were operating. But also a big part of that context, and an important part, I think, of a university stepping into this space of education, attainment in schools, is understanding the wider sort of context of the place in terms of other players, other people who are trying to do stuff. What is the vision for the place? So we very much have positioned our educational programme within this wider context of what is the city region about? What's the aspiration of the place? And how can improving education fit in with that broader vision? So I think it's really important that we don't look at schools, look at educational achievement in isolation of the wider sort of vision of skills and the context of the landscape which we're operating in. Next slide. And then just a little bit about us as a university, because I think actually who we are as a university was a big part of why we got involved in South Yorkshire Futures, why we set it up. So we recognised that, we were a huge organisation. We were a huge student body, over 31,000 students, 4,500 staff. Very much a university for the region with social mobility at its heart. We'd always done lots of things around outreach, working with communities, but that had tended to have much more focus of helping people on that journey into university. And we've been very successful at that. And around 40% of our students come from within 25 miles of the university. We also had a very strong academic base around the education landscape through the Sheffield Institute of Education. So we were very involved with schools, we were very involved in the education landscape, but that had tended to be very much about teacher training, very much a sort of workforce perspective. Next slide. So as Chris said, we had this objective which came out of the University Transforming Lives strategy, which was to drive long-term improvements in the educational health of the region by working with partners to improve attainment and aspiration from early years through to further and higher education. I think some of the words in this that are very important and probably were quite unique for a university was the fact that we started with early years. So this was not, although we'd always been involved with early years teachers, training people, this idea of actually working with the early years sector as a university was really quite a new idea. This idea of looking at, if we were going to really make a difference, we needed to go right back into the very early stages of education. It was no good just trying to work with people who were sort of post 16, post 14. Actually, there were some quite endemic things in the system that we needed to understand and to work with. So that was quite an interesting, very complete life perspective that we took. The next slide, please. So an important point, I think, is around social mobility. And this was very much driving what we were about. We recognised that education is the big thing that actually we can make the most difference in the short to medium term. There are lots of things that affect life chances for young people growing up in South Yorkshire. But actually, the thing that we can really probably focus on and make a real difference is education. Education transforms lives. That's absolutely core to what we believe at Hallam. And we believe that for our students, but we also believe that for young people growing up in South Yorkshire. So we wanted to, I suppose, take forward into the education system what we had been doing for years in our university with students, but take it back, right back into the earlier stages of education. So next slide. just to say then a little bit about what is South Yorkshire Futures, because I think initially when I started working on this programme, it was quite hard to describe to people what was it we were trying to do. What was this, a set of projects? What was it we were setting out to do? It very much is about creating a framework, helping to pull together a whole range of things that are happening into a coherent set of things that actually come together. And a lot of that is about building a shared vision, not just within the university, but more widely with a whole range of stakeholders, so that we could talk to people about, yes, we're trying to do something that you're trying to do. How can we work together? How can we collaborate on that? Next slide. So some of the key principles that I think are worth sharing and are very important. We responded to need. So one of the key things we did was we didn't go out and say, we're the university, we are experts, we're really good at this, we're going to tell you how to do whatever it is out there. We really listened to people. We identified the people we needed to talk to. We went out in a very open conversation about, okay, so what are the things you're trying to do? What are the issues you're grappling with? And then from that, we worked out, okay, could we do something? What did we have as a university that we could bring to the table that really might make a difference to that thing that those people were grappling with? And I think that open conversation led us into all sorts of different areas, which we would never have got involved in if we'd started from the position of thinking, what can we do? It was really important that we listened to what did people feel were the problems, and not necessarily that people felt that we were able to help them, but we just enabled them to talk about what were the issues, what were the things they were grappling with, and then we thought about where could we help and where could we not. We worked closely with existing stakeholders, so we were very sensitive. We didn't go in saying, you know, we've got all the answers. As I say, we were really listening to people. We were understanding what they were doing, trying to understand, okay, if that's what you're trying to do, we can perhaps help with that, or we can get alongside you, or we can somehow make that better or bigger than what you're doing already, but very much being sensitive to what people were doing. Part of that was building on existing programs. So a lot of what we've done is, you know, identified something that somebody was doing, whether it was a charity or some part of the system, and they were struggling with it because they didn't have the resources, or they just didn't have the skills, or it just wasn't quite at the scale or the size that they were looking for. And so we thought about, okay, what could we bring to that? This is a really good idea. It's working well at some sort of level. How can we make it bigger? How can we make it better? We did quite a lot of work on understanding the sort of data. And I suppose this is one of the things that we realized we had quite a lot of skill in actually analyzing data, understanding things that perhaps people had never quite looked at things in that way before. And this led us into thinking through some of the things that we might do, because once we understood the data, we were in a much stronger position to understand what would be the most sensible intervention. And also as part of that, we built evidence and we shared best practice. So we've captured things we've shared at a national level, and we've built on things that we've shared across the region and shared with other parts of the country. Next slide. So just to say a little bit about some of the activities we've done, and really just to give you some sort of sense of the type of things we've done, rather than this is in no way an exhaustive list of a whole range of projects that we've done. The Early Years Community Research Centre we have just opened. This was very much our sort of flagship project in the space of early years. This is where we have brought together our nursery that was part of the Hallam offer to staff, and created a nursery in an area of Sheffield with high demand, to really build a centre of excellence, so we can model what brilliant early years looks like, completely integrated with our academic interest in early years, but also a real place where our students can experience being in a community, experience that whole what it feels like to be in a nursery where best practice is demonstrated. That was a big project. We led it, we worked with the school, but it was a very significant thing where we did a lot of the work. The Early Outcomes Project, and Steph, who's on the panel today, has been very involved in this with us, and Steph was the initiator of this project. This was something where our role was very much to convene the 4 local authorities. We were a convener, we project managed it. We brought a quite different set of skills to that project, and it enabled us to get over £1 million into South Yorkshire, which actually probably wouldn't have happened without our intervention in that. So it's just something where we did some quite different things. South Yorkshire's Children's University is a very interesting project. This is a very good example of where we had people in the region who had this vision for a South Yorkshire Children's University, building on the success of what was there. But they just didn't quite have the capacity, they didn't have the ability to make it happen. We talked to them, we understood their vision, we shared their vision, and we got behind them to enable them to move that forward and remove some of the barriers that were in place. The GROW programme is a very different thing again, a programme where we're actually enabling our students who have graduated to do mentoring in schools as part of the COVID catch-up. We are completely running that. That's very much a programme that is being run within the university. And then improving connections between employers and schools. This very much goes back to my point about data driving what we do. We very much identified that in South Yorkshire, the connection between the most disadvantaged schools and employers is really poor. If you grow up in the more affluent bits of the region, you have really good connections, you have networks, the parents know who to connect with and how to help their children on careers. Some schools have none of those connections, have none of those links. So we've done quite a lot of work around trying to establish that facilities that enable employers and schools to connect simply. And there's a very great willingness from employers to do this, but the processes weren't there. So we've worked on creating those processes. Next slide. And this is my final slide, and I think it links very much to the point that Chris was making about choosing wisely. When we started South Yorkshire Futures, I think we went out, as I say, very much open to talk to people, not entirely sure whether the appetite would be there, what people would say. They might have said, you know, what, this is nothing to do with the university, get off our sort of pitch. We were overwhelmed by people wanting to work with us. And I think that was very interesting. The university had a great reputation. People really valued what we did, and they wanted lots of it. And there were all sorts of things that people wanted us to get involved in. And I suppose my sort of caution here, as you know, advice to other universities, is think carefully about the projects and the things you get involved in. Some of the things we've done, we wouldn't do again. You know, they are things where we are not the right people, we don't have the right expertise, we don't have the right skills. But it can be quite easy when people have got a good idea and they're asking you to get involved. But actually understanding where we can get involved, where we've got the really good skills, where we can add value as universities in this space is really important. And actually, I think that might be different for different universities. So some of the things we might be able to do as Sheffield Hallam, another university might not be able to do, and equally vice versa. So I think it's understanding what is it you've got as a university, what's your sort of base of skill and expertise, and how do you best use that against the objectives. So I'll stop there, Chris, but obviously we can pick up any of this as we go through the discussion.
Thank you very much, Greg. So now we're going to move to our panel. We have 3 panelists. I'm going to ask each of them in turn to speak for about 5 minutes, and I'll just tell each of them, I'll send you a little note about a minute before the 5 minutes is up. So our panel this afternoon consists of Angela Folkes. Angela is Chief Executive and Principal of the Sheffield College and in educational terms, my next door neighbour. We have Stephanie Douglas, who's Head of Service for Early Years at Doncaster Borough Council. And we have Sarah Ahmed, who is Head of Division for Secondary and Lifelong Learning at Huddersfield University. So I'm going to come to them in that order. I'll ask them just to talk to us, let's respond to Greg for, say, 5 minutes. And what I'll then do is to invite comments and questions from you. And if you would like to log a question, can you put the question in the question box of the application? So, Angela, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you. So I've been thinking about how to describe the work that we have been doing in partnership with Sheffield Hallam at the Sheffield College in terms of the education and skills system. And I think one of the things that I want to start by saying is that there's lots of research that shows that a really good education and skills system underpins prosperous, successful communities. That if we get that education system right, it's more likely that people will be in employment, and employment that they value, find worthwhile, find meaningful. And that contributes to social mobility in the way that Greg was talking about before. So some of the work that we've been doing is very much about knowledge, skills and behaviours that lead to that sense of productivity and prosperity. But it's tricky to get an education and skills system right. So one of the big things that we've been working on is how do you match the skills needed to the demands, as opposed to how to fulfill a demand where there is no need for those skills. And so it's turning things around a little bit whilst maintaining your institutional integrity and whilst meeting the needs of both people and place. And people can be described slightly differently. So often we have competing people to include. So first of all, I thought, well, what do we need to make something like that work? And you know, it occurs to me, and I do this routinely in my day job, that students should be, you know, the users of a system. The students essentially should be right at the heart of this. So this should be about what they need to engage them, to help them to be prosperous and successful. But that's sometimes at odds with what employers want, with where the economy is going. And so it's really important that any system that we put together, or that we're trying to put together, matches those things and make sure that you can build on that to bring something that's meaningful. So then I came to the challenges, because my actual brief was to talk about some of the challenges in having a partnership where you're trying to create something in an existing system that's more productive. And so I've got 4 C's. These are my 4 C's. So I think the first thing that we worked hard at this, and not to be underestimated, is clarity of purpose. So the first thing is clarity. So do we share an aspiration, and are we looking for similar outcomes? And do we actually get that bigger picture of, if we can really match the skills of the people in their places to the demands of employers, we really could create a prosperous and successful South Yorkshire. And in that, have we got the curriculum that we need? So are we offering the right things in the right places to the right people? And are we transparent about that? Is it easy to access that? And that links back to some of the work of South Yorkshire Futures as well. That idea that the people who are trying to access all of this may not be able to. Have we really got our hands on that and dealt with that? And then you have competition. And I think we can say that between Sheffield College and Sheffield Hallam, we've been really transparent about that too. Competition is inevitable. Our current national system encourages that competition. It's primed by funding, it's primed by opportunity. And if you can acknowledge that that competition is inevitable, and you can identify where competition will always be placed, then it makes the last C a lot more viable. The last C is collaboration. So how do you collaborate when there are so many reasons not to? And fundamentally, I think the challenge is to really get to grips with those last 2 C's. So if you can establish that competition is inevitable and that you're comfortable with it, it's so much easier to collaborate on something that would be a system for people in their place to become prosperous. So, and I have some examples of what we've been doing for later in the discussion if it's of interest. but realistically, those areas of collaboration that you can identify with partners. So being able to collaborate with the university about something that would lead someone, a person in a place, from level 2 all the way through to level 7 is a phenomenal achievement. Doing that together, as opposed to doing that in competition and making the landscape difficult for people who want to improve their skills. When you get to that, which is where we're at in some of our endeavours together, it's really clear what the benefits are, and it's really heartening when you have those kinds of opportunities. And so I suppose, you know, it's incumbent on us as public servants to really work hard to build a system that enables communities to be successful and prosperous.
Angela, thank you very much indeed. And we'll go straight to Stephanie.
Thank you, Chris. That's lovely. Thank you very much, Greg, too, for the introduction. I think our journey in early years began with Sheffield Hallam and Sheffield South Yorkshire Futures in 2017. I look back and think, goodness me, was it really that long ago? And it began initially with, as Greg described, an invitation to a conversation with the 4 South Yorkshire Futures leads for Rotherham, Sheffield, Barnsley and Doncaster like to come to a meeting and have a discussion. I think that in itself was the beginning of challenge for us. We've never worked together before. We never sat down in a room together, and we never knew, we hadn't been introduced formally in any way. There was a degree of anxiety. What were we all about? Who was going to organise this? What was the meeting going to look like? And a degree of wariness in this very, very new concept of a regional approach to looking at early years. It took us a little while, I have to say, and without the support of our colleagues from the university, we would not be where we were today, because we needed that guiding hand to lead us through working together. We're very different people. Our authorities are very different. Initially, the first way in which we sat down together was to look at common threads. And even in that, looking at common threads for our regional was difficult for us. We were not in a situation where we were willing to share information, data, all the key nitty-gritty and bits and pieces that make us competitive as a region. And it took us a while. So with the guidance that we received from colleagues, we were able to look at the national picture for early years, then the local picture for early years, and finally beginning to make it into a regional approach. It took us a while, probably several months in actual fact, before we were able to put together what we would call now, looking back, a roadmap to success. Really, really, really key to that roadmap to success for early years was identifying the key features for us. So we looked at school readiness, we began to look at leadership management, but our big feature, and that's still out there but much lower key now, is the concept that bringing early years to the forefront of education is really quite difficult. Those of us who work in early years often suffer from the feeling that because we don't do GCSEs, we don't do O-levels, we don't do Key Stage 2 SATs necessarily, how exactly are we benchmarked and how do we bring ourselves into that situation? Could not have done that today without the support of South Yorkshire Futures and without the university. They were able to bring to the region the importance of early years. And when you hear Greg talking about it today, it makes your heart sing. It makes you think we are actually getting there in acknowledging that our youngest children are where innovation and intervention starts. It was very, very good. One of the first things that we did was we put together a vision and a value for statement for South Yorkshire. It took us a while. We didn't agree. And there was a huge amount of conversation, but we still have that vision and value statement, and we still hold very, very much to it. It's due to be reviewed now at the 4-year mark. Hard to believe we're there, but that will be reviewed and there will be some changes. The role of the university throughout this has always been to share their expertise, which we wouldn't have, but also their time and to offer challenge as time has gone on. Really, really, really key. We began quite swiftly in 2018 to develop joint projects, activities that we could put together. Leadership and management of the early years with head teachers and deputy head teachers was identified as an area. We worked on that and we put together and we shared training. It was useful, it was helpful, but it didn't necessarily move us forward. So we knew we needed to take it a step further, and we began to look at school readiness. A massive issue nationally, we knew that, but we were actually able to work together and put together a regional statement for school readiness. It's not the same for all of us, it's different, but it has the core principles at the heart. And that for us was a really huge step forward. That now is used in all our family hubs, our children's centre, right across the region. As we became braver, and again with the support of our colleagues from Sheffield Hallam, because they give us the skills that we don't have individually, we began to look at funding bids. We were very fortunate, and I think quite brave, in early 2019 to look at the Early Years Outcomes project. We knew that communication and language was a massive issue. We knew we needed to do something really quite big and proactive. And with the help of the university in project managing, convening, working with us on research, we were able to put that bid forward, and we actually won a bid of £1 million. Almost unbelievable for a region like South Yorkshire, I think. And that has led us down a completely different path. So over the last year, with the issues that COVID have brought us, we've still been able to fulfil the aim to give us a South Yorkshire pathway for speech and language. Pathfinder approach, looking very different in each different authority. We've learned that we can work together and we can collaborate, but we don't always have to be the same. We've been very fortunate, and we've continued to extend that work. And with the support from the university, we've just won the Family Hub Evaluation Innovation Project funding as well. And we are the only local authority and university partnership nationally. And that will bring and make a huge difference to achievement across our sector. We value the work that we do together collaboratively beyond all measure, I have to say. So thank you, Chris.
Stephanie, thank you very much. So we've looked, so to speak, at the education system from different ends, from early years and from further education. And we'll now move into the middle. And Sarah, you're going to talk, I think, from a secondary and lifelong learning perspective.
Yes, thank you. And thanks for everyone for joining today. Yes, that's right. So prior to my role as head of division at Huddersfield University, I worked within a sixth form school in South Yorkshire for almost 15 years. So really, I'm coming from a perspective of working with young people aged from 11 to 19 years. I've had the opportunity to work with a range of students from culturally diverse backgrounds, and I was really able to explore the barriers that some of our disadvantaged students faced. Many of those who are from Black, Asian and ethnic minority backgrounds. Now, research does suggest that even before starting school, attainment gaps are apparent between children of different backgrounds, and this gap only widens as children get older. So I was at the stage where perhaps the gap was becoming significantly apparent. So really, I feel that in terms of what we've discussed today, when we do talk about disadvantaged students, there is a huge role that Black, Asian, minority ethnic students need to kind of play into it. There needs to be some sort of support for those students as well. So moving forward with what I'd like to be able to do in my role now as head of division at Huddersfield University is really provide teacher training. So my role is in teacher training now, and like I said, I've been able to explore the different barriers, and it really does come down to teaching as well. Outstanding teachers, that's what we aim for, but really what we need to be able to do is equip teachers to be able to be racially literate, especially with recent events such as the George Floyd murder. Children are aware of this and are having these conversations in the classroom, but are we equipping our teachers to be able to have these conversations, and do they feel comfortable enough to make perhaps the more vulnerable students feel safe? So I look forward to any questions from the audience as part of this panel. Thank you.
Sarah, thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. 4 different perspectives from Greg, from Angela, from Stephanie, and from Sarah. And one of the things that struck me as I was listening is that we were there looking at the education system through a whole range of lenses. It's often said that if you were designing an education system from scratch, you certainly wouldn't end up with the one that we've got, with quite sharp institutional barriers between different age phases. And I was really struck by really running across all the contributions, that sense of the tensions between collaboration and competition, between institutional priority and learner priority. I noticed that we've got one question in the question and answers at the moment from John Goddard, and it's good to have you in the session, John. John kicks us off with, how do you, for Greg, but I'm also going to come to Stephanie and Angela on this, how to decide on the division of labour between the university and other players, what to do, what not to do, and the question of how you know whether you're succeeding, whether there's a long time lag. So I'll come to Greg first, then I'll come to Angela and to Stephanie.
Yeah, it's a very good question, actually. So I think what we've done on South Yorkshire Futures is very much looked at the piece of work we're trying to do, and a lot of what Stephanie was talking about. So we've tried to identify what is the task that needs to be done, who are the people who are available from the university and from other organisations, what is the skill mix, and therefore how do we carve up the work. So what we've tended to do, I suppose, is, I think because as a university we have a very diverse set of skills, we've been able to fill the skill gaps in a way. So rather than being sort of going and saying we'll do stuff up front, we've tended to identify what other people can do, and then we've tended to do the thing mostly that other people haven't been able to do, because we've tended to be able to find that skill set from within the university. On the measurement point, I think that's been a really tricky issue for us in South Yorkshire Futures. And I think it's a tricky issue for universities in the whole civic space, really, because some of these things we're trying to have an impact on are very long-term, very big issues. I think the thing that we haven't got right yet, but we're sort of still working on, is it's being clear about what is the thing we think we can do, and measuring that we are achieving that thing, which is probably a sort of more, in many cases, an intermediate outcome, but one based on very strong evidence, rather than necessarily trying to track the long-term sort of educational attainment, because the link is just so hard to establish. But I think we've got enough evidence of the things, the building blocks that actually make a difference, and therefore measuring the building blocks is quite a useful way of measuring impact.
Thanks, Greg. Stephanie, let's come to you first. You indicated that sense of learning to work together across a region and across different players was a challenging period of time. You say it took a while. So how did you decide on the division of labour?
It's a very good point, Chris, and it did take us a while. And I have to say, I think we are still at times not always there. You know, it takes time. And I think it will depend very much, as Greg said, on the skills mix and upon what we're working on. What we've learned is that we need real clarity. So maybe for the early years outcomes work that we talked about, Doncaster was the lead authority. And at that point, I had to step forward and say, yes, okay, we will lead on this. And that was fine. I have to say, there has to be real honesty in the group. And there have to be occasions when you look at a project when people will say, that's not for me. I wish to be involved, but I can't lead on it. So the division, we've learned very much so that the division of labour will vary, and there will need to be real clarity at the very beginning of a project as to who's leading, who's supporting, and the roles of those people. That's been absolutely key and will continue to be so. We don't always agree, I have to say.
Thanks, Stephanie. That's really helpful. Thank you very much. And that sense of sometimes groping towards clarity, building as you go, is for me one of the long-term lessons of collaboration. It's that tentativeness that is really quite important. Angela.
Yeah, I agree with some of what Stephanie said, but I think it plays out in a very different way between further education and the university. And any relationship, it needs a lot of nurturing, a lot of attention, and it is fairly constant. And I think the key difference, though, would be there's such a lot of overlap between, well, there's two bits to this. So the first bit is there's a lot that the university does that the college would never, ever consider doing, and vice versa. And that's right and proper. And that is, in that sense, the division of labour is about which set of people are best placed to do which thing the best, who does it the best, who does it really well, and who's got the skill set to get things done. And then there's a significant overlap between what we do. And I think one of the, so in the fledgling days of our partnership, for example, we talked quite a lot about apprenticeships because both of our organisations do apprenticeships. And we identified 2 or 3 things. So the first thing was that from a college point of view, we were very, very clear that we weren't really looking to get into a market where we did degree apprenticeships, knowing that the university does this already. And the university is a better place to do that in general. But what we did want to do was articulate routes through from level 3, level 4, 5 to level 6 and 7, working with the university. And fortunately, the university could see that in reverse. So when we had that conversation, we had the kind of, actually, yeah, we've got some level 6, 7 and we could do with priming it from reverse. And actually, they're in the sectors where people will find work, where people will get work, where people will get promotions. But we had to have a fair few fierce conversations about which places there would be overlapping, alongside which places there would be a different, that really genuinely would be a division of labour. So in some of our strands of work, it's really clear who's doing what and who's best placed to do what. And in other places, we wrangle that, as Stephanie described it, we don't always agree, and we have some good wrangles. And sometimes we compromise and sometimes we don't. And as long as that's part of the relationship you're nurturing, then it's okay. It's not always easy, but it's okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you. There's a question got into the chat rather than the question answered, but I can pick it up. It's from Sharon. I'm not quite sure who you are, Sharon. So I'm going to pick this up. I'm going to pick it up in a slightly different way from sort of the way that you've put it. You asked a question about school readiness and university readiness. I'm going to just slightly tweak that because I'm going to want each of the 4 panelists to think about what success looks like. I began the session by talking about the challenges for universities in speaking, so to speak, to those who will not go to university, but whose education attainment is incredibly important for society and for their own individual aspirations. So I'm really interested here in a collaboration between a university and other partners. What is success? What does success look like? It's not just about university readiness. It's not just about, this is not simply about progression. What is success in this or collaborative relationships? And I'll start with you, Greg, then I'm going to go to Sarah, then I'll come to Stephanie and then to Angela. What does success look like?
I think one of the elements of success, if we were sort of asking the population, is that people would feel that the university is interested in them, whether or not they're going to go to university. So I think traditionally, the perspective has probably been the university is only really interested in people who might be on that journey, however far back from it, of going to university. And I suppose what we've done through South Yorkshire Futures is made a strong commitment that actually we are interested in all young people in South Yorkshire. And so for me, that sort of success is that, you know, parents, children might talk about talk about Sheffield Hallam from the perspective of they were really interested in me, not because I was going or not going to university. They were just really interested in me because of me. And I suppose for me, that's quite a big sort of success measure.
That's really helpful, thank you, and really speaks to the mission of the Civic University Network. Sarah, I sort of come to you next. What does success look like in relationships between universities and other partners?
Thank you. I do agree with Greg. I think if young people know that university is interested in them, then they're more likely to be interested in university. However, I feel that university is often seen as this unattainable kind of goal that some backgrounds, some families may not feel that they can achieve. So it really does come down to the child's or their parents' experience of education. So that could be from early years, secondary. Have schools been accessible to these parents, hard to reach parents? Have parents enjoyed their experiences? Because if so, they are more likely to push their children towards further education. Also, this is where role models are so important, because you can't be what you can't see. So if young people, especially from culturally diverse backgrounds, are not seeing people that perhaps look like them at university or in roles which require higher education qualifications, then they are less likely to go down that route, I believe.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And Stephanie, what does success look like for you in this space from an early years professional point of view?
I think from an early years point of view, for me, it sits at a number of different levels, Chris. I think that from a local authority level and the work that we do in early years, we've gained a massive supporter, haven't we? We've gained a voice. You know, we've allowed early years to roar without being, you know, too, I don't know what the word for it is really. It's given us a massive voice across all the different local authorities, and that's really important. I think regionally, for the staff we work with in early years, it's made them consider that they can move out of Doncaster. They can look over the wall into Sheffield for training. They can look over the wall into Rotherham for training. It's about social mobility, isn't it? Maybe not nationally, but just within our region. And I think lastly, and probably for me most importantly, it's about a recognition for our young people from early years upwards that university isn't just the place to go for a degree, is it? You know, which they find quite unattainable at all different levels. They're quite scared of that. It's a place where you can go and you can enjoy a learning experience that enhances your skills, you know, without feeling pressurized, and meet a group of people who are excited and interested.
Thanks very much. We might pick up some of the politics of this in Tony Gallagher's question, which I'll come to in a minute. But Angela, you go first.
Yeah, so what is success? I think there's the question of attainment. I think that universities add and can add a lot of value in an aspirational sense. So it's the added value of people connecting with schools, colleges, early years, wherever, whatever setting. I think that if a university in a civic sense can connect with young people wherever they are and talk about careers, talk about opportunity, talk about aspiration, and that's not about going to that university or any university necessarily. It's just saying, you know, what's out there. And I think it's important, as one of my colleagues said, to kind of outline what the possibilities are, because that's not always clear. And certainly for first generation potential level 4 students, that's really not clear. I think some of it's about opportunity. So there's wealth of talent in a university to share some of that knowledge, understanding and life experience just because you can would be an incredible civic duty, and is, you know, to role model or to just provide an opportunity for younger people to see what's out there, what's what, would be, you know, that's what success looks like for me, that it's the giving without necessarily wanting to get anything back. And I think the last one is, I'm just going to use a quick example. So our partnership, we've been working on a piece of work for protective services. And so at the college, we provide a level 3 access to HE in policing. And that leads on to degree apprenticeships in policing at Sheffield Hallam. And that's what success looks like in partnership terms, that we could see an opportunity for people to gain meaningful and prosperous employment in the region. It's really, you know, it's proper work and it's meaningful stuff, and it's at higher levels. And putting our brains together on this, we've got a skills offer that adds actual value and leads to a career. It's an apprenticeship route. So it's higher level study without feeling like university as an undergraduate residential student is the be all and end all. And I think that those are some of the things that make it feel like success.
It is. Thanks very much. It is really interesting just to consider the dimensions of success from different perspectives in the education system. Much more nuanced and richly textured than some of the discourse that we see in media discussions of successful outcomes. Tony Gallagher has I posted a really challenging and interesting question, which is in a sense arguing that such the collaboration, important and powerful though it is, might be letting government off the hook. And so what he says is some Scandinavian colleagues are wary of a civic role in this space for universities in case it acts as an excuse for poor quality public services. It lets the funders off the hook. So he says, to what extent should we combine innovation in addressing social challenges, which you all described, with engagement with government to improve the quality of public services? And I think there's a sort of specific question asked as well. I suspect the answer to the question is yes, we should. But let's just think about the political space here and the relationship between funders, activity and responsibility. And I'll come probably first to Angela, then I'll go to Stephanie, then Sarah, and then Greg, just to tell you which, give you some time for thinking. Angela, apart from you, because I know you and I know each other very well. You can think on the spot.
Well, I think that's a really, really interesting question. And I suppose on a personal level, when I think of myself as a public servant, and I have worked in the FE sector for the best part of 30 years. And so my expectations that government funders will get it right, will understand it, and will understand the vast impact of the FE sector is kind of challenged. I think that's the most polite way I could put that. And I think that you know, one of the things that we've realised in South Yorkshire is that actually what we do really impacts on the place that we live and work, and that's what we should be focused on. And sometimes, you know, yes, we all work really hard with government and we're constantly trying to influence. And I think, you know, we've done some joint influencing and some joint conversations and lots of separate ones. But at the same time, sometimes you have to kind of look to what you're doing to impact on the place that you live and work. And the partnership that we've got should have massive impact, regardless of funders, regardless of the national system. If we get this right, it would have a massive impact on the people that we live next door to, that, you know, that we work with all day, every day, whatever. And to some extent that matters. And I think there's work for us to do with politics and the political and economic situation, but we mustn't lose sight of the fact that the people that we serve should be first in the queue, as it were.
Thank you very much, Angela. And I can't quite remember whether I said I go to Sarah or Stephanie next. So whoever jump in. Sarah, off you go.
Thank you. I guess from my point of view, as working in schools as a teacher and various other roles, I think I can really talk about funding in this respect. We've had some really good projects which have built the bridge between those disadvantaged families and schools, so school doesn't look like an alienated place where only, you know, successful students go and go on to university and so on. It's really a place of a community cohesion. But we've had projects, like I say, where we've invited vulnerable families into the school to experience what perhaps a British educational system looks like, inviting parents from perhaps other countries where they've grown up and now they live in England, but inviting them into the school so that they know what the school looks like, know where their children study. And we found, after reflecting upon this project, how successful it was in building that community cohesion. Visiting perhaps the mosques where the students study after school was so impactful, so powerful, because the students could see their teachers visiting the mosque and actually understanding that there's a community here, that there's not two separate entities. However, funding cut that project completely, and it meant that that just totally lapsed. And again, when I was working within the sixth form, I found that actually that bridge had totally burnt and there was no community cohesion anymore. So funding such as that is so imperative.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Stephanie.
Thank you, Chris. I think it's an interesting question, isn't it? A good question. I think I would hark back to the fact that it's about the impact of what we do on the region and the place in which we're involved in. That's the key. That's the driver here. Wherever we may use that funding, it may well not drive children, young people into university, but it may well move them into a different place in their lives where these things are more accessible. For our very youngest children, we want them to assume that they can do almost anything that's put in front of them. So probably for me, the funding element is less important, but it's about raising their expectations, and that's what we're seeking to do.
So we've talked about partnerships, we've talked about expectations, and we've talked about focusing on the needs of the people that you work with. Greg, can you give us your sense of, are we letting government off the hook?
I think it's very much about realising the power of people working together locally. And I suppose it's sort of very much what Angela and others were saying, but there is real, you know, when people come together around a common vision, we can make things happen locally. And there is a danger, absolutely, that we fill gaps that should be done by other organisations. And I suppose to some extent, you know, as a university, we've been filling some of the gaps that would have been done previously by some other regional organisations that no longer exist. But a job needs to be done, places need to be improved, and actually the time is now. We need to get on with stuff. So I think we need to lobby government, and we need to not ignore the things we're trying to push. But I would really strongly object to the idea that we just do nothing because government should be doing it.
Thank you very much. There's a question, another question from Jean Goddard on the screen. Angela, you've typed the single word yes, so I'll come to you towards the end on this. Sorry about that pause. There's some scaffolders and window people replacing windows in our house. So one of the delights of remote working. Right, sorry about that. Question from John Lara, it's about widening participation funding. And I know the Minister made some comment on that in her opening address this morning. So John says, should universities use widening participation funding to enhance their civic role, even if working with schools and others in the local economy raises aspirations, but not necessarily going on to university? And Angela, you say yes, and I entirely understand why you would say that. But I think there's a wider question here, which is about the relationship between the public interest and self-interest. And I'm gonna ask Greg to come in on that first, and then I'll ask the others whether they want to make a comment without it's coming directly if they don't want to. But it was this relationship of what is the institutional interest and what is the impact of the institutional interest. Can you just sort of explore that, Greg?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question, and I think it takes us into not just about widening participation funding, but the broader issue of how do universities use student funding more generally. And I think there is quite an interesting debate as to what extent should we as university be using student fees to fund civic activity. What I think is quite interesting is what is it that students want? And I think there is quite a strong element that students are actually really interested in what their institution does for the place, and it's not a topic that is of no interest to them. So actually there's quite strong evidence that when students are looking at universities, looking to choose universities, they are actually very interested in what does that university do in a broad range of things, not just how does it teach the academic subjects. I think on the specific aspect of, widening participation, goes back, I think, to the beginning of our conversations today, that in a way that starts with early years. Children are forming attitudes to what is possible for them at a very early stage. So where I'm not sure it's very easy to draw a line to say activity with children of a particular age is not contributing to widening participation, because actually, when we find it very difficult to define. For many children, we're trying to convert them from, they've already decided that university is not for them, and actually the more we can work with children before they've closed down those options, I think the better. So I think that it's quite possible to work with a very young age group and justify that as being part of widening participation.
Thanks very much. Sarah or Stephanie, did you want to come in on that, or Angela, in addition to your one word?
I think I would echo exactly what Greg has said. For me, that's what it's about in early years. It's about those very young children and their aspirations, if you like, when they're in the home corner, what do they want to be, those children? What are they talking about doing with their lives and in their play? So we begin that journey right at the very beginning for me, not at 18.
Sarah?
Yeah, I completely agree. It does start from a young age, as Stephanie said, because when we think about children whose parents haven't been to university or even passed through the British educational system, we're faced with a huge challenge here, where children may not even know what university is or what higher education looks like. So really the question arises, what are we doing with the parents of these children, as well as the children themselves?
Thank you. Angela?
Happy to expand on my yes. You knew I would be. So I was fairly, unequivocal about it, because I think you can't underestimate lifelong learning. So you can't underestimate that people aren't always ready at the same moment in time to talk about their learning and their learning opportunities. And I think for universities in their place, I think it is absolutely critical that universities invest time and energy into the places where they are, to inspire and to embed aspiration for people at all ages. And that plays into what Sarah's just said, to some extent, because this is about parents of children who may themselves at some point return. They may return through degree level study whilst they're in work. They may return through an access course onto an undergraduate course. But to stop if you think you aren't going to get a client, a customer, I think underestimates the power of a really solid, excellent education and skills system. And that's why I was kind of fairly unequivocal about, yes, we should invest in the places and the people in those places where we are.
Okay, thank you very much. There's a challenging question in the chat, and it may be the last question that we have time for in this session. And if we were in a face-to-face setting, I might just ask for a slight gloss on it. But what the question is should universities accept some of the responsibility for training, says, out-of-touch middle-class street-level bureaucrats mediating between central government policy and implementation? I'm not quite sure whether they should accept the responsibility or take some responsibility. But can we just think about this sense of universities and the education system in a divided society? and that sense of, and I think it might be a way that we can use this question just to pivot to the sense of, does collaboration of this sort, how does collaboration of this sort fit into our wider sense of the civic responsibilities of universities? Stephanie.
Now that's a good question, Chris, isn't it? That's something you would need to think about, isn't it? I don't have a very clear answer to that. Because I don't live in Sheffield. I'm not always so clear. And I would say, gone to the original question is, I doubt any of my early years providers who find themselves doing any kind of qualification at Sheffield Hallam would call themselves middle class bureaucrats at all. They're people there who want to further their skills, to improve their lives and to gain in confidence, which is not the answer to the question that you asked, is it? But I think that's really important.
Yeah, it's sensible. I mean, I'll come back and ask you a follow-up question about place just a bit later. Angela.
I mean, I think that sometimes unwittingly we do this anyway. So I've been, given that extra couple of minutes thinking about what the divided city looks like. And I think that if we, in partnership, we could do an awful lot to improve social mobility. We could do an awful lot to close some of the gaps that Sarah has described as, in her experience. And I think that from a civic point of view, and certainly from an FE college's point of view, FE colleges are so, embedded into their local communities in general, that sense of divided is quite stark when you work in an FE college. So you have, you have the community that is learning in the college, and you have the kind of community that's sort of working with the college outside that. And if by bureaucrats, that's sort of some of our partners who are our funders or who are our key stakeholders, there is a significant gap between the people who we work with and the people who we work with and for in a different context. And I think that naturally in FE, certainly we accept that responsibility to close those gaps and to work in that civic sense. I think what we have the opportunity to do is to work in partnership across this discussion, the stakeholders that are here, for example, to really change that, to really make an impact on that. If we could grapple with that a little bit, we could make a significant impact. And in some places we do, but there is more to do. And I do think that to an extent, we have responsibility to look at those divisions. I don't think we're ever going to crack it all just through education and skills, but I do think we have some responsibility.
Sarah, I am going to come to you and ask you for any comments on this. I am just going to ask each of the panelists, after I've come to Sarah and Greg, I'm going to draw this to an end. I got each of the panelists just to give me a final thought on what is the one thing that gets in the way of effective collaboration to enhance the education system, and what's the one thing that's the most important driver. So just one from each of you. But Sarah, first of all, your question on this. Then I'll go to Greg. Then we'll come around the four panelists on that final question. Sarah.
Thank you. Yeah, I completely agree with Angela there as well. I can't really say much in terms of in terms of the street level bureaucrats element part of things. But I do think university does play a part in that. If I'm looking at teachers, and some may describe teachers to be middle class white people, which they tend to be. If we look at the figures nationwide, we're talking perhaps 7% of head teachers across our country being from Black, Asian and minority ethnicities. And really, what's that telling our young people? Is that not achievable, or is that just for white middle class people? So my role now as the head of division in secondary education is to prepare our secondary teachers to go into the workplace and being aware of what is happening in the classroom and outside of the classroom. Because people come into teaching thinking it's a 9-to-3 job, but actually there's a lot more to it, and I feel that that's my responsibility as part of the university to provide that education to our trainee teachers.
Thank you. Greg?
Yeah, I think we do have a responsibility, but I think there's also quite a lot we can do to bridge the gaps, really, because I think one of the things that we've identified is many people want to do things to help, but they just don't know how to do it. So actually what we have at the moment, particularly in Sheffield, is a lot of capacity and a lot of people with skills and resource who don't know how to share that with other people. And it's not they don't want to. And actually one of the initiatives we've been working with is something called Sheffield Businesses Together, which is actually trying to make the processes so that people from the business world can link up with schools and other organizations and share what they know, what they've got. And actually one of the barriers that's very much been identified through that is it's not they don't want to do it, they just don't know how. And actually the more we can help them, give them processes, the more I think we can share the resources we've got in a city like Sheffield so that everyone can benefit rather than it being just benefited for the few. So I think there's a lot of appetite to do it, and I think we can really help in partnership to make it happen.
Okay, thank you very much. So let's now just come to the panel for a final thought. And my question was, sorry about that. They're just knocking off for the day. My question was a challenge that gets in the way of collaborative working and something that is a driver or a plus. And what I'm going to do is to work through Stephanie, Sarah, Angela, and Greg. Stephanie.
For me, Chris, what gets in the way? What's the barrier? I think it's having the confidence given to you by those that you work with to take down the traditional barriers. I still hear too often, no, we can't do that because we're not allowed to. And I want people in the region to look over the wall and go, yes, we can. Let's do this. And we've done that, and I'm proud of that. So I think for me, it's a very simple barrier. It's a tradition. We can't. You know, it's to have confidence to be braver.
And the driver?
And the driver for me is to allow early years and those people who work with very young children to have a voice.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Sarah.
For me, I think it's really about the willingness and the encouragement coming from the top down. So the senior leaders in schools showing that willingness to actually impart on whatever CPD they can provide to their teachers so that they are equipped with managing and dealing with some of the barriers that young people face. And the drivers, I think there's quite a few, but I really think that, you know, after speaking today as well and listening to others, community cohesion and partnership with higher education, early years, it's just so important.
Thank you. Angela.
I'm just going to slightly break your rule by offering two barriers. So my first one would be national policy and bureaucracy often prevents good action. And it's often really difficult in that context to shed the competitive ego, the sort of self-interest bit. That's really difficult to shed, but if you can shed that, you've achieved almost, you know, that's almost unicorn status. And then the sort of the better. I think if you can find a shared vision for better, something that you can put your energy behind and really drive, which I think is what Stephanie's been describing actually from an early years point of view. I think that shared vision is the thing that really galvanizes energy.
Thank you very much. And Greg, pull this together for us. A driver and a challenge, or a challenge and a driver.
Yeah, so I think the challenge is very much what others were saying really, which is sort of mindset or structural things that make people think we don't do that or we can't do that. And we need to challenge that and make sure that people don't have that mindset. I think the driver is about giving people that space or somehow enabling people to come together behind a shared vision. So actually, when you get people in a room and they can all get behind something, we can really achieve an awful lot, because actually people want to do stuff and actually they do want to pull in the same direction, but there's not always a space or a mechanism to do that. So I think regionally, the more we can do that, the more we can really make things happen.
Okay, thank you all very much. On this really interesting session, we've covered a huge amount of ground, the education system from early years through to further education in universities. I thought some really interesting explorations of some of the things that support and challenge effective cooperation. A couple of things that I took away from this was Stephanie's sense that this is a developing piece of work. It never stops. That working with people in other organizations is always a matter of learning as you go. Sarah's point early on about making sure as we focus on systems, we also focus on disadvantaged and minoritized groups. Angela's point that there are tensions between competition and collaboration. But I hope you found it interesting and engaging to hear from Greg about the shape of South Yorkshire Futures. It is a large programme. It's not a predefined programme. It changes and develops as it goes. I hope you found this session engaging and interesting. Thank you all very much indeed for joining us.